Okay, hi everyone. Happy winter solstice. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our virtual Speaking of Nature series. My name is Ali Esposito and I am the Conservation Education Outreach Coordinator here at Mueller Field Station. Before we begin, I just want to introduce the field station like usual, if you aren't familiar with us, and just give you some updates. So Mueller Field Station is part of Finger Lakes Community College, and the field station itself is located in the southern Honeyway Valley. Here at Mueller, we provide place-based outdoor environmental education for FLCC college students, K through 12 students, and community members. And if you are interested in seeing more of what we do here, we encourage you to follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. And recently, we've been posting environmental themed weekly quizzes, and people are really loving them. So you can find those on Facebook. Our January Speaking of Nature is scheduled for January 26th on a Wednesday at 6 p.m. And we have titled this one The Big Ten at Mueller Field Station. And that is going to cover a lot of interesting and fun facts about the common mammals found here at Mueller Field Station and the local, area. And that one is actually going to be given by myself and another educator here at Mueller Field Station, Chelsea. So this is one that's encouraged for the whole family to come. It's kind of more geared towards younger people. So, if you have any young ones at home, tell them to watch this or, pull it up for them. Okay. Uh, One more thing. So if you are interested in watching any of our previous Speaking of Natures, they're all posted to our YouTube channel. This presentation tonight will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel as well. All right, I think that's all I have to say. So moving on to the main event, tonight, Joe Hurley from Kettle Ridge Farm is joining us. And Joe is the owner of Kettle Ridge Farm, and that is located in Victor, New York. He has been a beekeeper for over 10 years. And in addition to wildflower honey, the farm also produces maple syrup. The farm also offers tours and farm-to-table events. So they have a lot going on there, and I can put their website in the chat for you to check out. Really, really cool operation you have going on there. Joe spent 30 years as a tax expert, and he is the best-selling author of the book, Best Way to Save for College, which I pretty much should have, known about this book a long time ago. Sounds very interesting. So Joe is going to tell us why beekeeping is worth the backache and the bee stings. And before I pass it over to you, just for the audience sake, the chat and the Q&A will be open, but we won't take questions until the end. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Joe, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ali. I appreciate the invitation to be here from Ali and also from Akasha Veka, who's actually one of our employees at Kettle Ridge Farm. And Akasha hooked me into this, so I appreciate that. I will try to start up my PowerPoint here. Let me know if it doesn't come through properly to you. So hopefully you see that on your screen.
I
Kettle
do
Ridge
not
Farm.
see it.
Okay, great. Local trees, local bees. And as Ali said, we are located in Victor, New York.
Oh, wait, Joe, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
I don't see your presentation for some reason. I don't know why.
you cannot see it?
I cannot see it.
Hmm.
You have the share capability, right?
Uh,
There.
let's see here. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Share. Um,
Let's see. There we go.
is that on? Okay, so now
Yep.
you can see it?
Yep.
You can still see that?
I can see it perfectly. Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm not very technologically adept. even though I owned a website for about 15 years. But yeah, Kettle Ridge Farm in the hamlet of Fishers, and we make maple syrup and honey. And as Ali said, we've been doing more of the ag tourism activities, farm to table. Uh, one reason we do that is because we could never make enough maple syrup or honey to pay the bills around here. Uh, there just aren't enough maple trees in Victor, and and certainly honey is not a real big opportunity in this area either. But ag tourism really allows us to do what we love to do on the farm. Local trees, local bees. I started the farm over 10 years ago after working for 30 years as an accountant, and I came into this with absolutely no knowledge. My wife and I moved from Penfield to Victor on 50 acres, and I just loved being outdoors and said, well, is there anything I can do out here? I actually sold my publishing company and decided, well, maple syrup seems like something I might want to do, and honey seems like something I might want to do too. So I just kind of jumped into it. I made every mistake that there is to make, but eventually figured out some things, and I think I'm doing better now than I used to do. And I actually decided to go back to school to learn more about horticulture and conservation and the outdoors. So where did I go? Well, I went to FLCC, of course, and I learned a lot from my instructors like Berna Tukonchek. I'm sure some of you know her. Bruce Gilman, learned a lot from him. So I just really enjoyed all my classes at FLCC. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to you tonight. Kettle Ridge Farm, we named it that because of the topography. We have lots of kettles in this area, which are ponds or swamps formed by the glaciers. And certainly we have a lot of high ridges, which every maple season I have to climb up and down these ridges many times. And I do tend to lose weight during maple season. In fact, an average of 10 pounds a year comes off every maple season. So that's probably good for me. Let's talk about honeybees tonight. And if you have any questions, put those in the chat. I'm not sure if we'll answer those as we go along or wait until the end. But I'm going to concentrate on the honey side of the business. If you have questions about maple syrup, I'd certainly be happy to answer those well. And we're going to talk about why anybody would want to keep honeybees, because certainly you are going to get stung if you're keeping honeybees. I get stung maybe 20 times a year, despite all the protective equipment. I'm wearing the veil and I have the smoker going to try to calm down the bees, but they always seem to get inside my bee suit, or they can actually sting through my suit or sting through my gloves. But I'm used to it. It's no big deal. I'm not allergic. Very few people are actually allergic to honeybee stings, but if you are, certainly that's serious to have some sort of anaphylactic reaction. Then obviously you won't be keeping honeybees, or you don't want to be anywhere around honeybees. Honeybees really don't sting unless they feel threatened. So that's one of the points I tried to bring home to kids, especially, is if they see honeybees just foraging for nectar or pollen out in the grass or in the flowers, those honeybees are not going to sting, and there's nothing to be afraid of in getting fairly close to those bees. But besides getting stung, certainly you're going to overheat because you're wearing this suit, this protective gear during the hot summer days when you're out there with the honeybees. Uh, and your back is going to hurt because those boxes full of honey can weigh up to they can weigh up to 80, 100 pounds. And when you're lifting those around all afternoon, you're going to feel it in your back. But in spite of all those aspects of beekeeping, it's really something that's a lot of fun and I think totally worth doing for anyone who might be interested. Here are some of the reasons that I've come up with to share with you tonight. First is you're going to be getting honey and beeswax, two very popular and desirable products from your honeybees. The honey that we make at Kettle Ridge Farm is raw honey. That means that it hasn't been pasteurized or processed in any way. It's essentially just the honey coming straight off the honeycomb. We strain it so that any other particles that you don't want in your honey do get strained out, but then it goes directly into the jar. And the reason that raw honey I think is preferred is if you do process it or pasteurize it, you're really destroying a lot of the very beneficial enzymes and other components of the honey that make for a healthy product. And if you go into a grocery store and just buy off-the-shelf honey, you can be pretty certain that it's been processed, that it's been pasteurized. It'll be nice and flowing honey. It'll look very clear. It may come from China and not say that it's from China. There's a lot of bootleg honey that's being distributed in the United States. And the problem with some of that honey is it's using corn sugar, cornstarch instead of honey. So it has other fillers in it because that makes for a cheaper product. The real stuff, the raw honey, is going to crystallize after some period of time. Some of our honey will crystallize after 2 weeks. Once it's taken out of the honeycomb. Some of our honey doesn't crystallize for a year or more. It really depends on the source of the nectar that the bees are making their honey out of. Certain nectars will crystallize sooner than other nectars. And so if you start studying the different honeys, you'll become fairly familiar with how that operates as well. And certainly I didn't say, I mentioned beeswax on the slide before. Beeswax is a very useful product as well, used to make candles, used to make a sort of grease for wooden drawers and things like that you want to slide. It makes for great waxes on tables. So beeswax is a commodity that's actually pound for pound is as valuable, if not more valuable than the honey itself. So this slide shows you a frame of honey. This is a very nice looking frame, just packed with honey. This probably weighs about 5 or 6 pounds. And once the bees pack it with the nectar, and they've basically ingested it, and then they'll put it into the honeycomb on this frame. And then they have to dry out that nectar or that honey, and they do this by fanning the honey with their wings until the moisture content gets down low enough where it becomes a very stable product. And at that point, the bees will put this layer of wax over the honey, basically to seal that in, and then it will keep for a long time. In fact, raw honey will keep for years and years just on the shelf without refrigeration because of the low moisture content. Bacteria and other types of germs just simply cannot live in that type of environment. They dry out when the moisture content is that low. And they found honeys that are actually hundreds, if not thousands of years old, stored away, and found that it's still good. It's still edible honey. So it's really quite amazing. What we do when we bring this frame into the sugar house is we'll take a hot knife and slice off that layer of wax covering up the honey. Then we'll put these frames into a large spinner, and that spinner will get started up, and then all that honey will just come spinning out of the frames through that centrifuge type process. And at that point, we'll just, as I said before, simply strain it and then put it into the jars. Another reason to appreciate honeybees is because of their pollination services. Plants and flowers, trees need bees to pollinate the flowers, and honeybees do a pretty good job of that process. There's, I forget what the percentage is, but basically 70% of the food that we eat depends on bee pollination to make it to our plate. So without bees, we would really be hurting as far as our food sources go. Some beekeepers will rent their bees out for pollination services. And those tend to be the larger beekeepers that can send hundreds or thousands of beehives out to farmers around the country for their pollination services. The largest pollination event in the world is actually the almond crop in California, which every year in January or February around that time attracts, I think, about 2 million hives that get trucked in to pollinate those almond trees. And so that's just a huge event. And the beekeepers who do it actually make a pretty good living by providing their hives for those pollination services. For them, the honey is a secondary source of income. Pollination is really the number one source of income. We don't do any pollination services at Kettle Ridge Farm. We don't have enough hives. We don't have the trucks to bring them around. We don't really have the desire to get into that business. I'm not convinced that it's really good for the honeybees themselves to be doing that type of pollination, because it means that instead of having a fairly diverse diet of nectar and pollen, it's just a single source for a couple of weeks or maybe even a month, whether it's almonds or whether it's blueberries or whether it's pumpkins, any of those things. If a bee is relying on that single source, it's just not as healthy for the bee. So I don't expect that we'll get into pollination anytime soon, unless we really decide to expand our beekeeping operation. Here's a few photos of honeybees on different flowers around the farm. This is coltsfoot, which is one of the very earliest flowers to come out in the springtime. It's not native, and I should say that honeybees are not native either. Honeybees all came from overseas at some point, whether it was Europe or Asia or Africa. There are no native honeybees in the U.S. So for that reason, a lot of these honeybees do tend to prefer some of the non-native nectar sources. And coltsfoot is a good example of a non-native nectar source. This is a nice photo of swamp milkweed, which is a local, or which is a local native plant. And clover, the source of a lot of the honey that you buy in a store is clover, mostly from out Midwest. This is the white version of swamp milkweed, one of my favorite plants. And this is white snakeroot, which grows abundantly around our farm. White snakeroot is a source of pollen for the bees, not of nectar, and that's probably a good thing. It's a beautiful plant, but it's a very toxic plant to animals, especially large animals. If a horse or a cow eats snakeroot, they're likely to become very sick and perhaps die. Snakeroot tends to grow in the shade in the understory of the forest where you don't have horses pastured or cows pastured, so it's typically not a huge problem. The interesting factoid about snakeroot is that Abraham Lincoln's mother died from drinking milk provided by a cow that had been foraging on white snakeroot. So she got the sickness, which I guess a lot of people in that time tended to get sick from white snakeroot. But it's like I said before, it grows in abundance around here. And this is a goldenrod. Our fall honey crop is mostly goldenrod because that's what really comes out in the fall, and the honeybees love the goldenrod. And you can tell when the honeybees are on the goldenrod because the hives start smelling like dirty socks. For some reason, that goldenrod gives that honey sort of this funky smell. The honey itself is delicious. I like the goldenrod honey. Some people may not because it is a little bit of a stronger taste. And our approach at Kettle Ridge Farm is to harvest the honey maybe three or four different times during the spring, summer, and fall, so that the honeys do take on a different taste depending on when we harvested that particular crop of honey. A lot of beekeepers will wait until the fall and take off all their honey at once and process it at once. But we like these different honeys. We don't call them varietal honeys because we can't really prove which flowers or trees were being the nectar was being taken from. And certainly the honey is a mix of different flowers. But the spring honey, we know that the bees are on the black locust trees in the springtime and the early spring wildflowers. It produces a very light, delicate honey with a very delicate taste. It's a honey that does not crystallize very quickly, so it does stay fluid for quite a while. The summer honey that we get is to me particularly delicious because the bees go after this plant that grows around us called motherwort. Again, it's a non-native plant and it's in the mint family, but that honey takes on a very slight minty taste, which is just delicious. And then, as I said, the fall honey is typically the goldenrod honey. Another reason for keeping bees is for the medicinal benefits of the products that come from the honeybees, and there are several. Certainly, I mentioned that raw honey is full of nutrients and enzymes that are helpful and healthy. The pollen is also a health food that you can find in health food stores. The pollen is basically protein. People who have allergies often will ingest pollen, either as just the pollen itself or as the pollen that's contained in raw honey to help with their allergies. It helps their system fend off those particular allergies in the future. So we have quite a few people that are purchasing our raw honey because they know it contains local pollen that will help their allergies. Propolis is an interesting product. It's basically the glue that bees make and use to stick things together in the beehive. So if you go into the beehive and you see that there's these large clumps of sort of very sticky substance, brown substance, that's propolis. And bees will make that from trees, basically from the sap of trees and other parts of the tree that produces the propolis. Again, it's just packed with these very, very beneficial chemicals and enzymes. And so you can purchase propolis in pill form, I think, in the health food stores. And then venom is an interesting one. Honeybees, when they sting you, will naturally put some venom into you, and that venom causes your system to react in a negative way. But actually, the venom can be very helpful if administered for certain conditions like arthritis, because it can reduce swelling. My wife, who used to be a nurse in a cancer setting, found an article recently saying that venom has been found to be helpful in treating certain types of cancer now, which is pretty exciting. There was 1 year when an individual was coming to me and actually wanted to purchase honeybees because she was stinging herself in order to treat her Lyme disease. So she had read that the venom was useful for Lyme disease. Nothing else had worked for her. She'd tried everything, but this Lyme disease was truly debilitating to her. But she started stinging herself and feeling much better because of those bee stings. In fact, she told me that she was up to 24 stings a day, 3 days a week. And so needed quite a few bees to do that, because anytime a honeybee stings, the bee dies. The stinger gets pulled out of their body, and the bee will then suffer a quick death. So that's why she had to keep replenishing her bee supply. I thought that was pretty interesting. Here's a photo of the bees at the entrance to the beehive, and those are little flakes of pollen that they've collected, are bringing into the beehive. The pollen is actually used to feed the brood in the beehive. They mix that up and with some honey, and that's the brood food. Honeybees are fascinating. It's a reason, certainly a big reason, why I like beekeeping. It's the life of a honeybee, the life of a hive is unique. The way these things work. In fact, you consider that the way that honeybees work together as a colony. It's often considered that the animal, the entity, is actually the colony and not the individual honeybee, because they just work together in a way that no other insect works, with the exception of ants. Ants are similar in how they work together as a colony and honeybees. So we can talk a little bit about the honeybee colony. Usually, starting out in the springtime, the colony will have, maybe 5,000 honeybees that have survived the winter. 3,000 to 5,000 typically, if it's done a good job getting through the winter. And by the middle of the summer, that colony population has climbed to probably 40 to 50,000 honeybees in the colony. And that's because of the queen. Every honeybee colony has one queen, and her only job is to lay eggs. And so she'll be laying up to 1,500 eggs per day. And the other bees around her will make sure she's kept fed, she's kept clean, she's kept protected. Everything is done for that queen to be able to lay eggs. And if that queen starts getting too old, maybe not laying eggs up to the expectations of the other bees, they'll kill her, and they'll basically swarm around her and overheat her to the point where she dies, and they'll simply make another queen out of another egg that's in the hive. It's the adult worker bees that are taking care of all the business in the hive. And these worker bees are all females. There are no male worker bees in the hive. And this is what they do. They keep the hive clean. They will be the ones out there gathering the nectar and the pollen. They're the ones that are making the honey and storing the honey, and they're also the ones that are protecting the hive and using their stingers to do that. The worker bee will live typically about 6 weeks and essentially works herself to death because she's just so busy over her lifetime. And her role changes as she gets older too. So, when she's very young, first hatches out there, she might just be in the hive taking care of brood and helping to keep it clean. It's not until she's much older, like in the 5th or 6th week, that she becomes a bee that will be protecting the hive, so a guard bee. The males are called drone bees, and their only purpose is for mating, nothing else. They don't do any of that work that the females do. They don't even have a stinger, so you can't get stung by a male honeybee. What they'll do is on a nice day during the summer, they'll take off, and they'll all fly to what's called a drone congregation area, and they'll be flying around hoping that a virgin queen bee flies through to be mated. And so if that happens, then the males will all rush to try to mate with that queen bee in flight, and maybe fewer than a dozen will be successful in doing that. And it's sort of a good news, bad news sort of thing for the males that actually succeed in mating, because when they do, they die. Their parts get ripped out and they fall to the ground dead. So it's not the best thing. The other problem that the drone bees face is that the worker bees kick all the drone bees out of the hive before the winter, because the worker bees realize that these drone bees are essentially useless to them. They're only going to be eating the honey during the winter that the worker bees need for themselves. So all those drone bees will be kicked out of the hive to die before the winter. And you won't have drone bees until the queen starts laying eggs the following year. Drone bees are birthed from unfertilized eggs, I should say. Worker bees require fertilized eggs. So the queen bee can basically pick and choose her eggs in determining whether she wants to produce drone bees or worker bees. This is a slide of the worker bees on a frame of brood. So each of these cells contains an egg that has hatched into a larva, and then the worker bees will feed that larva until it becomes big enough to essentially pupate within the cell. They'll cover it with this papery substance that you see in each of those cells, and it takes about, I guess it takes about 21 days for an egg to become an adult honeybee. And this is a shot of a hive during the summer that seems to be doing pretty well, very populated. It was probably a very warm day, so a lot of the bees were outside the boxes to try to cool down. Bees are in trouble. Another reason that beekeepers are actually needed. Uh, here's a shot of some of our hives during the winter time. Bees can make it through the winter time typically without too much problem. Um, even in the cold winters, unless they're sick. Sick bees have a very hard time making it through the winter. And unfortunately, more and more bees are sick every year because of the mites that are chewing into the bees during the fall and the summer. These are essentially mites that didn't exist in the United States 35 years ago. They were imported, but now these Varroa mites, they're called, are really the biggest problem facing honeybees because they're in every beehive. They do make the bees sick. A beehive that's not treated can crash very quickly from an overload of these mites. So we do treat the beehives with some acid wash, which will help to kill the mites, but not harm the honeybees. But still, it's much more difficult to have bees survive the winter these days, and the percentage of hives that actually do survive tends to be about 50% for most beekeepers. Another shot of the beehive in the wintertime. Nice warm day, so the bees will come out. What can you do to help? Well, there are a few things that you can do to help honeybees. Uh, one would be to provide suitable bee habitat. So have flowers, trees that provide nectar and pollen for the bees. And I have a couple of slides just to demonstrate this point. Here's a beautiful little pond that my next door neighbor has. Very well kept. The problem here is that there's absolutely nothing there for honeybees, probably for any other type of bee or insect or bird either. It's just basically a swimming pool made out of grass and mud and silt. Take a look at the pond that we have behind our house, and you'll see that it looks much different. So we have every sort of wildflower, what you might call weed, growing next to the pond. We have all sorts of insects visiting these plants and flowers for their needs. A little bit of cardinal flower there. This is one of those hummingbird moths. I think it's a beautiful little moth that's flying around with the bee balm there, the bergamot, I think it is. So some of the other things that you can do, support local beekeepers when you're purchasing your honey or your beeswax. I'm sure there's beekeepers that are close to you that are selling their products. So be supportive of what they're selling so that they can keep doing that. You can consider becoming a beekeeper yourself. It's not that hard to do. Typically, beginning beekeepers will start out with a couple of hives and take some classes. I started by taking classes with the Ontario Finger Lakes Beekeeping Association, which would meet every month in Canandaigua. They had a special beekeeping class over a period of, I think, 3 months, and you just learn a lot about beekeeping, and you're assigned a mentor, someone who can help show you the way as you're first starting out with beekeeping. You can also report your bee swarm sighting. So if you do see a bee swarm hanging out in a tree or on a building, what's going on here? Well, bees swarm in order to reproduce their colonies. It's basically a survival mechanism, and bees will tend to swarm, which means that approximately half the bees in the beehive, along with the queen, will leave the existing hive and go set up a new hive someplace else. Um, they tend to do this once their hive gets very crowded. Um, and a lot of beekeepers will try to take measures to prevent their bees from swarming because it means they're losing a lot of bees and a lot of potential honey when their bees are taking off on them. I don't really try to stop my bees from swarming. I figure, it's what they want to do. To go through a lot of steps to try to prevent them from swarming is a lot of time and effort that probably isn't going to mean much anyway. They're going to swarm regardless. And I just feel lucky that my beehives continue to produce a lot of honey even after they've swarmed. So they seem to recover pretty quickly. But if you see a bee swarm, call your local beekeeper. It's really the best way for a beekeeper to get new bees because it doesn't cost them anything. It's typically very easy to go out there and collect the swarm. So here's a photo of me up on a ladder in a tree, uh, taking a swarm that had been called into me from the homeowner, and I just sort of plopped it in a box. As long as the queen is somewhere there in that colony, all the other bees will just hang with her, and I can take her back or take the hive back to my bee yard and just install it in one of my boxes and have a brand new beehive to take care of. It's kind of interesting. I got a call today from someone who says, I have a swarm on a tree in my yard. Can you come and get it? And I was surprised because I had never heard of a honeybee swarm in December. Usually the bees are hunkered down this time of year. They're not out swarming. They're not out flying around unless it's a really nice day. And and I said, "Are you sure they're honeybees?" "Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely." And "Do you see them?" And I said, "Yeah, I see the honeybees." So I decided to drive out to Macedon, about 10 miles away, and take a look at this swarm, and found the tree. And it wasn't a honeybee swarm. It was just an old paper wasp nest that had nothing alive in it, and it was falling apart. So a lot of people don't really understand what honeybees look like and don't know how to distinguish them from yellow jackets or hornets and things like that. But so I came home thinking, well, next time I'm going to ask them to send me a photo of the swarm before I actually go out and try to collect it. Save the Bees, Please is sort of an effort that we have going on at Kettle Ridge Farm. It's a basically a program we have. People can sign up to Save the Bees, Please, and what we provide them with is a nice T-shirt, some honey, a beeswax candle, and some seed bombs. So we have these seed bombs made with the seeds of native wildflowers that can be thrown around and start to plant or start to grow some new wildflowers for the bees. But it's really just sort of a fun educational type product that people might buy for themselves or for their kids or for anybody else. So life should be sweet, and that's our slogan at Kettle Ridge Farm. And at this point, Allie, I'm certainly open to any questions that anybody has.
Thank you, Joe. That was mind blowing, some of the things that you said. I'm gonna keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A and see if anybody has anything to say. I have a question about Japanese knotweed. I was wondering if that was in abundance by you at all, and if you've had any, like, I don't know, if you can tell if any Japanese knotweed is being used in your hives or from your bees.
Uh, there is certainly Japanese knotweed in the area, and honeybees love Japanese knotweed.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't think we have a lot of it close by, and I certainly don't encourage it because it is such an invasive uh, plant. There are honey, uh, there are there are honey producers who rely on Japanese knotweed as a source of a lot of their nectar,
Yeah,
and they certainly encourage Japanese knotweed. So there's sort of a split in the
yeah,
beekeeping community between those that just want these plants to proliferate that produce good honey versus those that don't like the invasive non-native plants and want to keep things as native as possible. I'm in the latter corner. I don't want to promote invasive plants. Um, out in let's see, what's the name of that? There's a plant out in the Midwest that they call star thistle, but it produces a lot of the honey out there, but it's extremely invasive,
hmm,
and it does exist around here too. Some of the beekeepers have actually lobbied against efforts to eliminate some of these invasive plants.
hmm.
Um, but again, like I say, there's a split amongst
Totally.
beekeepers between those who want the invasives and those who don't. Uh, Purple loosestrife is another good example. You know,
Hmm.
purple loosestrife produces a lot of honey, but it's so invasive, and the steps have been taken to really reduce the population of loosestrife, which has affected the honey production of those uh, beekeepers who relied on purple loosestrife.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's nice to hear your opinion because I've been reading up on the Japanese knotweed, and there are certainly honey beekeepers that speak, that they need it. It's one of their main sources, and that's how they make their money. So
Right, right.
interesting. We do have some questions. What were some of your first mistakes as a new beekeeper?
Um, First mistakes as a new beekeeper, I'm still making mistakes,
Mhm.
but one of the mistakes you can make as a new beekeeper is going in and checking on the bees too often, because every time you open that hive, you're kind of disturbing the flow of what's going on in there. But you want to check on things at the same time because you hear about all these potential problems and issues in the hive. Maybe the queen has taken off and the hive has become queenless. That's probably the number one worry that beekeepers have is a queenless hive. Because if you don't have a queen and the bees haven't started making a new queen, that hive will eventually die out. And so you'll want to go buy a new queen to install a new queen. So that's one of the problems. The other one is just not recognizing some of the problems when you do inspect the hive, um, and making certain assumptions about the health of the hive. You may think, well, I don't have these varroa mites because I don't see any, and I've looked very closely and I don't see any varroa mites, so I'm pretty sure I'm okay. Well, the problem is most people will not see varroa mites until the hive is totally overwhelmed with them. You have to do testing to see what your varroa population is. So you have to either use a sample of bees and shake them up with some sugar in order to release the mites, or else you have to put the bees in alcohol to release the mites and then count the mites. But that's probably one of the more important jobs is to keep track of the mites that are in your beehives.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Do large farms out in the Midwest that plant monocultures have an effect on bee populations?
Have an effect on what population?
Bee populations.
Uh, well, you could be talking about native bees, uh, which those monocultures definitely do have an effect on the native bee populations, and that's become a big problem in certain parts of the country, probably most of the country, is that we're losing our native bees. And native bees are very important to the ecosystem, obviously. Uh, and some are blaming the monocultures for that, which is seems to make sense. Some people are blaming beekeepers, honey beekeepers, for some of that too, because if you only have a certain amount of nectar out there, and you just have a huge number of honeybee colonies that are going out to the nectar sources, does it leave less nectar for the native bees? And I think that might be a problem in certain parts of the country. It's certainly not a problem around here. We have plenty of nectar for every type of bee. There's more than enough nectar. This is just a great area to be producing honey in because there's just so much that's growing, both for the honey bees and for the native bees.
Okay. What breed of bee do you have? Or
Uh,
breeds?
they, they're mostly Italian. I'm sure they're a mix of different types of bees, um, but it's whatever the bee club provides. The Ontario Finger Lakes Beekeeping Club. You can actually purchase bees through the club. They have the bees shipped up from South Carolina in the early springtime, and they're mostly Italians. You could buy other types of honeybees, Russian honeybees, uh, uh, Carnolian, I think they're called honeybees. So they have different traits. So some bees are known to produce more honey. Some bees are known to be more prone to swarming, like Italian bees are prone to swarming. So you may see more of that if you have Italian honeybees. Russian honeybees are used in order to control the problem with mites because Russian honeybees evolved with these mites. That's where the mites came from originally. So the Russian honeybees have a defensive reaction to mites that helps the bees survive the attack by the mites.
Cool. Right. If anybody has more questions, feel free to enter them into the chat. I did put your website into the chat too. Do you sell things online? You have products that you can purchase online.
Yes,
And
we have an online store, so you can certainly order products online.
okay.
We've
And
also,
oh,
I
sorry.
didn't mention this, Allie, but
Mhm.
we also became a New York State farm micro winery about a year and a half ago so that we can make mead out of our honey. So
Oh,
we're one of the few mead producers in this part of the state. And mead is simply wine that's made out of honey instead of grapes.
hmm.
And so we'll be using our honey to make the meads, and we have different flavored meads that we've been making. So that's been a fun process to do that.
Wow. You do a lot of things there. It's so cool. I need to come visit. Unfortunately, I've never been able to visit yet, but
Oh,
it's on my list of
you
things to
should.
do.
In January, every Sunday, starting January 8th for maybe 7 or 8 Sundays, we do pancake Sundays.
Oh,
So we have a drive-through pancakes with our maple syrup. And so that's a good way to come and visit the farm and
yeah.
get something good to eat too.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, it looks like our questions are coming to an end. Everybody's saying thank you. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending. We'll see you in January. Remember, January 26th, that's a Wednesday at 6 p.m. is our next Speaking of Nature. You can find that on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you very much, Joe. That was really a great presentation. I learned a lot.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And
Thank
then
you for the invite.
absolutely. And if you can just hold, like if you could just stay around and everybody else will hop off. I just want to talk to you real quick. Everybody's leaving.